student. She's a junior now. This is a book that she was required to read in her AP history class. And I thought, she was very disturbed by Howard Zinn. She came to me and said, Mom, this book is really bothering me. I can't sleep well, and it's just making me feel bad. I don't know why. And I thought she was just being a big weenie, so I said, hey, give me that book. And so I took the book, and I started reading it. She had only gotten to page 20 in a 700-page book before she was so disturbed she came to me. I got to page 6 before I was so disturbed I couldn't read anymore. Then I went and looked up who Howard Zinn is. Remember, this is required reading. This is a socialist, a communist. Even better, socialist is a pretty name for what I think he is. He's a communist, but he's obviously anti-everything that we believe in our family. So I'm very, very offended. So I told the teacher, under no circumstances will we be forced to read this book. You'll find me a different book. So I think the instructor was working on that, which as parents you have a right to say that. We will not fill our child's head with this. You give her a real history book. And so he came back with a little list of history books. Well, in the meantime, I went and looked up some history books. I started talking to historians, and guess what a lot of them said? Right here. I said, you need to go look up Larry Schweikart. I didn't know who Larry Schweikart was. Turns out, he lives right in my area. Turns out, he's a professor just up the street at UD. Didn't know all that, but I bought 2 of these books online and had those delivered to the house, and that's what my daughter's going to read. Right. So, I'll let Dr. Schweikart tell you more about himself, but he is, like I said, a history professor at UD. I can read a little bit more about him. Dr. Schweikart is a graduate from Arizona State University. He got his PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And in between, played in a rock band for many years that opened for Steppenwolf and other known acts. I know. In 1985, he took a position at the University of Dayton, where he continues to teach. His Patriots History Book of the United States, written with Mike Allen, was New York Times #1 bestseller. His 7 Events That Made America America was also a New York Times bestseller. Currently, the 2nd volume of A Patriot's History of the Modern World is due out at Christmas. This is the kind of book, if you just want to listen to me, and if you don't, read it for yourself, this is the kind of book we should be requiring our students to read. Okay? There. Dr. Schweikart.
Thank you. Sure. Let me give you a couple of things to jot down before we start. A couple of websites. One is patriotshistoryusa.com, all one word, patriotshistoryusa.com. If you're teaching out of Patriots History, it has map links, it has test questions, it has some curriculum, not a full curriculum, and it has additional material not in the book. If you want to use Patriots History with a full-fledged curriculum, go to the classicalhistorian.com, and they have a full curriculum with Patriots History and our Patriots History Reader, which contains all of the major documents in American history, plus a few that you might be surprised by, such as Obama's Cairo speech is in that, and the Hilo speech is in, Hilo decision is in that. So those are at classicalhistorian.com. Also, for all of our film work, I was going to play a trailer, but really we didn't quite get the AV stuff ready to go in time, so I don't think I'll do that. But I came out with a documentary film 2 years ago called Rockin' the Wall, which is a history, Cold War history of how rock music helped bring down the Berlin Wall. It was on PBS last November. We just sold it to Mark Cuban's Axis Television Network, which is good. Helped pay my investors back. For that and the trailer for the theatrical version of Patriots History that we're starting to fund and make right now, go to Rockin' the Wall Studios, R-O-C-K-I-N, rockinthewallstudios.com, and just look at projects and click any of them and you'll see all the films that we're working on. But Patriots History is up there. Rick Santorum's group down in Texas has given us a pledge of half the money if we can raise the other half to make Patriots History, so I think we're going to be able to do it. And then finally, if you're a Twitteraholic, I'm on Twitter at Larry Schweikart. I think I reached 1,400 followers yesterday. Not Ashton Kutcher exactly, like 23 million, but. So let's get this out of the way. Yes, I was in a rock band. I'm the guy in the Jaws t-shirt. This is after we opened for Steppenwolf in West Palm Beach. Note the platform tennis shoes. All fashions come back, and these came back again a few years ago. If I'd hung on to them, I would have been right in style. Me and my little set of drums. A group called Savoy Brown. In 2004, Mike Allen and I wrote a surprising bestseller, Patriots History of the United States. The interesting thing about that book was that we didn't have a contract when we wrote it. We just started writing it, and then we took it to publishers, and we only got 2 offers. And I can't to this day tell you who the other offer was from. It was a very unknown publisher. The one we took was from Sentinel, which is a part of Penguin, and then it became a very good seller all the way up until 2010, when a friend, Bert Folsom of Hillsdale, invited me to get on the Glenn Beck show. And I gave Glenn a copy of Patriots History, and he said, do I know this book? I know this book. Do I know this book? And if you've read Patriots History, the correct response is, this is a great book. Yeah, everything I write isn't great, but that's a great book. And Modern World is just as good, especially when you put the 2 volumes together. But, so I knew Glenn hadn't read it, so 5 days later I get a call at home, hey, this is Glenn Beck, and I read your book over the weekend. I had not read it when you were here. I go, yeah, Glenn, that's okay. So, no, I read it over the weekend. It's a great book. And he starts holding it up every night with little yellow possums and dog ears and all. And this one he had 3.5 million viewers, right? And all of a sudden, it starts going up to #1 on the on Amazon. Then I start getting the calls from the publisher. Hey, your book's going to be on the New York Times list this week. Hey, your book's going to be in the top 10 this week. And then I get the famous call. You can hear the office in the background. They're woo-hoo, they're partying. Woo! You know, they're partying way back there. They're having a good time. Your book's going to be #1 on the New York Times. I said, yeah, that's good. No, you don't get it. It's going to be #1 on the New York Times. I said, no, that's fine. That's wonderful. No, Larry, you're not getting it. It's going to be in Target. It's going to be in Costco. It's going to be in Walmart. I said, wait a minute. My book's going to be in Walmart? Thank you, Jesus. Because it meant that we were reaching average people that I want to reach. I don't care if we sell to the New York Times. I don't care if they read. I want to reach average, everyday people. But of course, I'll take celebrities. You know, if Tom Brady of the Patriots wants to read Patriots History, I'm down with that, you know. So I'm sure it was just a publicity stunt, but nevertheless, it's cool. After Patriots History, the publisher suggested, and somebody back there was talking about the endnotes. We were talking about, wow, there's a lot of stuff in the endnotes. There's a ton of stuff in the endnotes because we, unlike Howard Zinn, we actually source things. You know, Howard Zinn doesn't have a single footnote. But we have like 40 pages of endnotes. I counted one time, about 1/3 were dated. They were articles or books since 1990, meaning that they were as up-to-date scholarship as you could possibly get. And so we have a lot of discussions. You know, did Roosevelt know in advance about Pearl Harbor, things like that, and where we couldn't put it in the text, we put it in the endnotes. So the publisher said, why don't you do a book about these debates, about what people in history books say. So the result was 48 liberal lies about American history. And in that book, I took 20 of the top U.S. college and high school books, not mostly high school, most of them were college, but some are used in AP and other classes. I took the top 20 books and I looked at what they had to say about a whole range of subjects. Not every book had all of the 48 liberal lies in it, but most of them had 2 or 3. So one thing I did was I looked at images, pictures. If you look in the 20th century section of these 20 books, the most common image you will find in that 20th century section will be Franklin Roosevelt. I have no problem with that. I think that's reasonable. You know, he was president for 3,000 years, so and he presided over a depression and a war, which we won. So yeah, he should be covered. Second most common image in the 20th century section of textbooks was some depiction of the atomic bomb, which I think is fair, appropriate, reasonable. The third most common image, though, in these books was not John Kennedy. It was not the moon landing. which is on the cover of our new book, was not Ronald Reagan, was not Martin Luther King. The third most common image in the 20th century section of these books was the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, so you all know who this guy is. John Wilkes Booth killed President Lincoln. He was correctly identified in all of these books as a Confederate. In one of the books, he was also identified as an actor. But he doesn't shoot Lincoln because Lincoln gives him a bad review. He has fundamental ideological disagreements with Lincoln. So how is this man described in the majority of the books? A Marine, a former Marine, a deranged Marine, an ex-Marine. Okay, when they used a qualifier at all, in every book except one, it had him being a Marine. So here are a few of the most prominent lies that I found in the book. These are the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Lie number 16, the Rosenbergs were not spies and were wrongfully executed. You realize everyone is set up like a lie, right? Jeannie Boydston in her book, The Making of America, a popular college textbook. Julius Rosenberg, former member of the Communist Party, and his wife Ethel were convicted in a controversial trial on charges of conspiracy to commit espionage and sentenced to death in April 1951. I just realized that's when I was born. Coincidence? The controversy over their guilt has continued to the present day. No, it hasn't. There's no controversy over their guilt. It's established beyond a reasonable doubt, including by their longtime collaborator, Morton Sobel, who late in life told their children that your parents were spies. And even the Meerpole brothers said, well, if Morty said they were spies, they must have been spies because he would know. But that doesn't stop the historians. Mark C. Carnes, in his book American Destiny, wrote, although they were no major spies, and what they revealed was not important, the Rosenbergs were executed. Not major spies? Passing the single biggest secret of the late 1940s to the most deadly weapon in human history to your avowed enemy is not important. What would you have to pass? Nude photos of Anthony Weiner? Yet a third textbook, and one of the worst, John MacFarrager's book, Out of Many, said, quote, the government's case against the Rosenbergs rested on the testimony of their supposed accomplices, some of them secretly coached by the FBI, except the evidence that convicted them was the schematic of the atomic bomb in their possession. I don't know how you coach a schematic. I haven't figured that one out. Now, the Rosenbergs may be murky figures to most of you, and what's their significance to us? Not much except in the universal way that these books deal with them. Oh, and when the Soviet Union fell and the KGB's archives were opened up, there were the Rosenbergs front and center in the Venona files listed as agents. None other than Nikita Khrushchev. Some of you will remember him for this. Right? And we have to believe Nikita Khrushchev because he's a communist, and we're always taught that we have to believe communists. Nikita Khrushchev said that the Rosenbergs provided, quote, very significant help in advancing the Soviet A-bomb, unquote. How about another one? Line number 41, transcontinental railroads never would have been built without government. Thomas Bailey and David Kennedy in a book called The American Pageant, which many of your schools use for its AP classes, probably the best-selling history book of all time, say, quote, transcontinental railroad building was so costly and expensive as to require government subsidies. John Blum, in another very good selling book, The National Experience, writes, some form of public credit was essential to build the transcontinentals. Well, we have a problem. This guy, James J. Hill, a one-eyed Canadian, I have his eye there to make sure that one-eyed Canadian built a totally non-subsidized road called the Great Northern Railroad, and it was important to us not just because he built it and it wasn't subsidized, but because it's the only one not to fail in the Panic of 1893. The others were all built so crappily because they were getting paid to lay track. And just as an aside, just think of how stupid that is. You're paying railroaders by how many miles of track they lay. I tell my students it's sort of like rewarding you guys with grades by how many words you write. You know, I get a paper like this. It's just insane. So anyway, James J. Hill and his Great Northern was a great railroad that didn't go broke. This one's particularly timely. Just 5 years ago, then candidate Barack Obama announced that we needed a new cabinet-level position, a czar, for high technology. And he cited the transcontinental railroads as his example. I suggest to you that's the last thing we need, especially after the rollout of the website. Anyway, this is Sacco and Vanzetti, line number 17, Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent. Many of you don't know all that much about Sacco and Vanzetti, possibly. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti in April 1920 were two anarchists who robbed a factory paymaster, killed a security guard in South Braintree, Massachusetts. They were arrested for that and a second robbery, tried, convicted, given the death penalty. Critics claim they were executed because they were political activists, not because they actually did the crime. Mark C. Carnes and John Garrity in their book American Destiny say, quote, their trial was a travesty, and Carnes and Garrity linked their execution to the excesses of, and I quote, fundamentalists, the xenophobes, and, of course, the Klan. These historians just really have the Klan on their mind, which makes me wonder if some of them aren't like closet Grand Dragons or something, but they constantly go back to the Klan. Gene Boydston's aforementioned book, Making a Nation, says, quote, the state doctored evidence and witnesses changed testimony, but the judge favored the prosecution. Virtually every book I looked at implied or stated outright they were innocent based on a single fact. They said they were innocent. Let's see. Casey Anthony, Joran Vandersloot, and oh yeah, OJ. They all said they were innocent. Okay. Truth is, modern ballistics experts in the 1980s performed tests on Sacco's gun, concluded it was the murder weapon, it wasn't tampered with as historians claim. Sacco and only Sacco had access to the gun. It matched slugs found at both crime scenes. 9 witnesses saw Sacco at the scene of the shooting. 4 identified Vanzetti there, and Sacco had other cartridges of the same make and model on his person when he was arrested. 30 years later, though, one of the witnesses who tried to provide an alibi for Sacco and Vanzetti came forward and said, yeah, I lied when I tried to provide an alibi. That didn't stop then-Governor Michael Dukakis from proclaiming the duo innocent in 1977. He said all disgrace should be removed from their names. Well, to add a cherry on top, in 2005, a letter surfaced from socialist author Upton Sinclair, who had championed the two, in which Sacco and Vanzetti's own attorney admitted that in fact they murdered the guard. Many of you remember this one. This is Iron Eyes Cody, the famous crying Indian, Chief Iron Eyes Cody, who was featured in the Keep America Beautiful 1979 public service ad. In the famous ad, viewers watch as this Indian paddles up a creek, a polluted stream. Smokestacks are belching their stuff into the air in the background. Then he gets on a horse and he rides to the top of a ridge, and you think he's going to see a beautiful mountainside or whatever, and it's a highway, and the coup de grace, a bag of trash, comes flying out and lands at his feet, and this tear trickles down his face. It's all fake. The tear is glycerin. The chief is an Italian named Espera DeCorti, born 1904 in Kaplan, Louisiana, to a family of Sicilian immigrants. He became an actor, and he played an Indian in over 100 TV and movie episodes, although he wasn't Indian in real life. But he, in particular, kind of exemplifies or illustrates the notion that the whites destroyed all of the buffalo. John Mack Farragher's book, Out of Many, another popular book, says, quote, and it shows you that they can't write in addition to do history. Here's the quotation. The changes they produced in some areas were nearly as cataclysmic as those that occurred during the Ice Age. Having killed off giant herds, ranchers and farmers quickly shifted to cattle. In other words, having killed off the buffalo, they quickly killed off the cattle. This passage lies in several ways. First, It does not mention the most recent research from Princeton historian Andrew Eisenberg, Brown anthropologist Shepard Kretsch III, and University of Missouri Missoula historian Dan Flores, who all conclude that the Indians were hunting the buffalo to extinction before whites got there. It was a slower trajectory, but they were already on their way to making the buffalo extinct. They all get correct that whites greatly accelerated the process, but it's important to understand that the Indians were already on the trajectory before whites arrived. Some Indian tribes, not all, but some believed that buffalo were infinite, and one in fact held that they came from a lake in Canada. It's sort of my students' view of their parents' money. Now, how many of you have heard this, and if you're a teacher, don't raise your hand if you actually taught this. You know, Dr. Schweikart, the Indians used all parts of the buffalo. You heard that? Yeah. It's true, but it's not what you think. You envision that they kill a herd of buffalo and then like locusts, and nothing is left, right? But that's not what's meant. It's meant that they used all parts of the buffalo, but not all at one time. If they needed meat, they'd kill a herd for the meat, leave the bones, leave the hides. If they needed paint, they'd kill a herd for the blood, leave the meat, leave the bones, leave the hides. If they needed hides, they'd kill a herd for the hides, leave the meat, leave the bones. Okay? And we have proof of this from all sorts of settlers and scouts who would go across the plains and see entire herds of carcasses just laying out there. This is long before whites would arrive. Now, they get the true part, that whites arrived and greatly accelerated the extinction process. There's no doubt of that from any quarter, that hunters like Buffalo Bill Cody, armed with long-range rifles, could take down 100 animals in a single day. But here comes a part no book mentioned, that it was private ranchers and philanthropists, virtually all of them white, who saved the buffalo. J.P. Morgan purchased a ranch of 20,000 acres specifically for bison raising in the West, populated the land with herds. Cattleman Charles Goodnight captured buffalo calves in 1878, developed his own private bison herd that by the early 1900s had grown to 700 animals, and he gave it away to Canada's Wood Buffalo National Park. Other ranchers bred beefalo, which is a combination of cow and buffalo, for their meat, and they advertised, "We supply buffalo for zoos, parks, circuses, and barbecues." This led ranchers to protect other species by breeding them, then selling the rights to hunt them. There's a ranch in Texas, for example, that has more of a certain type of antelope than exists in all of the areas of Pakistan where that animal is native, because they breed it and they keep it around to hunt. It's a very common theme in the 19th century that textbooks miss, that the robber barons were, in fact, friends of wildlife. I didn't bring the slides, but I usually discuss John D. Rockefeller at this point, who saved the whales. You might think that Greenpeace saved the whales, but really it was John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller's kerosene got so cheap that Americans quit using whale oil, which was the major form of interior illumination at the time. And, I could show you some charts that would prove this. I'm convinced that when James Cameron, with his submersible, gets down to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, he's going to find that the whales have built a statue to John D. Rockefeller, and that once a year, like Muslims to Mecca, all the whales arrive and do the whale thing, pray to the Rockefeller statue. Anyway, when parents ask me how to tell if their kids' textbooks are biased, I say, go to the section on Reagan, look in the index, look at what it says, find the page on Reagan. I call it the pregnancy test of bias, and Jon Stewart thought that was pretty funny, so he quoted me saying that, and then he showed a picture of Reagan pregnant, which I thought was kind of funny. No matter how reasonable or fair the books are up to this point, they go over the edge when they start dealing with the Gipper. So I have 4 different lies and 48 liberal lies about Reagan, but I'll only look at 2 here. Lie number 4, oh, there's our friend Rockefeller and the whales. The Reagan tax cuts caused massive deficits and debt. Most textbooks absolutely lie about the Reagan years and the coverage of the economy. What they don't say, in fact, I only found one textbook that came anywhere close to using this number, was that in the 8 years of Reagan, the U.S. produced 14 million net new jobs. Net. More than we lost. Europe, during those 8 years, produced 0. Germany today would trade us Munich and 2 soccer players to be named later for 14 million net new jobs. I'm telling you, it's an incredible growth rate. But they harp on the deficits. And they try to argue that the tax cuts caused the deficits. They did not. It was spending that caused the deficits. Tax revenues rose and rose a lot under Reagan after the tax cuts. They went up 40%. All we had to do is just hold spending constant, and we would have been out of debt, or at least out of deficits, not out of debt, but out of deficits by the end of the 80s. But all of the books I looked at harp on this, the deficits and the debt, and it's really bad in American Pageant. This is a chart straight out of American Pageant. You don't see the title up top because I cut it, but it's a chart from American Pageant. And the heading is Deficits in the Reagan Years. And you can see that it looks like, gee, under Reagan, these deficits just went absolutely crazy. What's wrong with that guy? Is he a nut? What's wrong with him? Well, the key is up in the upper left-hand corner where it says billions of dollars, and there's a word that should be there that isn't there, real. These dollars are not adjusted for inflation. So I took the trouble to adjust their numbers for inflation. But also, you know, over time, how much you owe is relative to how much you make. I mean, I'm sure if some of my kids saw my Citibank bill, they would just, they'd commit suicide if they thought they owed that much. If Bill Gates saw my bill, you know, he'd throw it on a stack to be paid later, like in a year when it amounted to real money. So how much you owe depends really on how much you make. It's a percent of GNP. So I did their work for them. This is the chart. Real dollars is a share of GNP. It's not even the same chart. Let me see if I can go back. There we go. But these guys are historians. They're not economists. Maybe they just screwed up. Maybe they just made a mistake. Well, no. Same chapter, same topic, i.e. Reagan's an idiot. And this one is the national debt. And again, the idea is that debt just skyrockets under Reagan. What was wrong with him? How could he be so such a spendthrift and so forth? But they go even further. There's a little trick in this chart. Might remember the old Sesame Street game? 3 of these things are kind of the same thing. 1 of these things is not quite the same. You have a parrot, a parrot, a parrot, and a boa constrictor. Which is different. See, the boa constrictor is different. So let's play the Sesame Street game, shall we? Depression is an event. World War II is an event. Japan surrenders, that's an event. Korean War, that's an event. Vietnam War is an event. Reagan is a person. See how clever that is, how sneaky that is? And a kid reading a book isn't going to read the book 9 times out of 10. They might look at the graphics. Remember, we already had the KKK. Oh, that's what 20th century America's all about, it's the KKK. And now they're saying, oh, Reagan's an idiot. Well, again, it's not adjusted for inflation as a share of GNP. There's a real chart.
Larry?
Yeah.
What is the atomic doomsday clock doing while Reagan is spending some of that money?
I suppose it's getting closer to 0.
Getting away from there. We're moving away.
Moving away.
Yeah. The doomsday clock. We became safer under Reagan.
Oh. Not if you're the guys in charge of running the clock. They thought Reagan was going to start a war any day.
No, they backed it all the way.
Did they really? Well, okay.
All the way to 17 minutes before midnight, from 2 or 3.
Gee. That surprises me. Anyway, there's the chart overlaid. You can just—it's a bad overlay, but you can kind of see the trend there. Let me see. This is, and of course the whole notion that the rich, you know, tax cuts for the rich, that it favors the rich, is just nonsense. Now you can see that the bottom 4 decimals here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, now 4 out of 9. That the bottom 4 groups actually paid less in taxes. Their total contribution in taxes fell by anywhere from 5 to 26% under the Reagan tax cuts. You can see that the rich paid more and the super rich paid a heck of a lot more because they were making a lot more money and they were paying more in taxes. Line number 9, which is very common in these books, Mikhail Gorbachev, not Ronald Reagan, was responsible for ending the Cold War. James West Davidson's book, very popular book, Nation of Nations, tells us, quote, Gorbachev's reform policies led not only to the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but also the breakup of the Soviet Union itself. See, all that military spending under Reagan was unnecessary. Good old Gorby was going to demilitarize the Soviet Union by himself. George Tyndall says in another very good-selling book, America, A Narrative History, Gorbachev backed off Soviet and imperial ambitions. I guess that's why it took him several years to pull out of Afghanistan, right? He was backing off. Anyone who thought Gorby was giving up on imperial ambitions, it's hard to see in this slide, but Gorbachev had a red birthmark on his head, and I swear that when the Soviet Union was up and running, that birthmark would take on the map shape of wherever they were invading next. Afghanistan! Look, everybody, look, it's going into Afghanistan, I'm telling you. And I can prove this because it vanished after the Soviet Union fell apart, but it started coming back when Russia was talking about going into Georgia. But does that look like Georgia to you? Is that the map of Georgia there? So anyway, so you have the ever-reliable book, Unto a Good Land, that says, quote, perhaps more important than Reagan, under a new, younger leadership, the Kremlin allowed long-dormant forces of change to emerge and drive the USSR toward democracy and a market economy. Now first, as an aside, when this picture was taken, Gorby was 56, and I'm 62. So, you know, he was 6 years younger than me when this picture was taken. My students don't walk around UD talking about that young and vibrant Schweikart, you know. But they talk about Gorby like that because his predecessors were all older than the Crypt Keeper. They were all 12 million years old, you know. Anyway, Reagan introduces his plan called the Strategic Defense Initiative, 1982. The media and liberals quickly labeled it Star Wars. And Reagan, by the way, hated that name, but it turns out to have done him a great, great favor. They wanted to ridicule it. And back in my day, when you wanted to ridicule something, you called it Buck Rogers. This far out, you know, crazy stuff. Commander Cody. I like this one. You can kill an alien and unplug your toilet at the same time. It's a multi-purpose alien killer, you know, sucker. But they called it Star Wars because they thought that would make it seem crazy and to ridicule it. And in fact, they did Reagan a favor because the American public had seen a lot since 1960. We put a man on the moon, we were putting space shuttles up all the time. Lasers were fairly common by that time. No, they weren't doing laser surgery on people, but people knew about lasers, and everybody had seen Star Wars, and everybody knew that Reagan was Luke. Reagan had that young kind of bounce to his step. There's a great moment up in Iceland where Reagan is meeting Gorbachev for a summit talk, and Reagan comes out with just a coat like this, and nothing over his head, and he comes bouncing out, and Gorby arrives in one of those Soviet-style pillbox hats with big old coats, and walks out like this, and even the reporters who hate Reagan go, wow, he looks older than Reagan, you know, and because Reagan's attitude was that of a younger Luke-type guy, and of course that meant that the Soviet dictators I think he tried out for the part. I think he auditioned. And that, of course, means that Gorby, you all think of Darth with the helmet, but trust me, if you take his helmet off, it's Gorbachev. Now, the fact is that Star Wars was just one part of his massive strategy to bankrupt the Soviet Union. I think that our chapter in the new Volume 2 of Modern World is just great. I mean, I love the chapter on the Cold War and Reagan. I think it's, to pat myself on the back, I think it does the best job of interlocking economics and foreign policy, because it was across the board. Reagan, by eliminating inflation with Paul Volcker, struck a key blow against the Soviets because they needed hard currency. And where do they get hard currency? From oil and gold, both of which plummet when we get rid of inflationary problems in America. He pressured the Saudis to pump more oil, which further brings down the price of energy in the 1980s. We set up phony companies to allow the Soviets to steal our stuff. It's a program called Line X. It's an amazing program written about in a book by Paul Kengor. And the Soviets think they're stealing this high-tech stuff. We're feeding it to them, except what we give them is stuff that's going to break catastrophically in 1 year. And so they have all of these turbines in their Trans-Siberian pipeline, and 1 year after they steal the stuff, this pipeline blows up and sets them back for years, costs them hundreds of millions of dollars. They knew we could make Star Wars. We hadn't made it yet. I mean, at the time, we hadn't made a thing. But they knew we could do it, because in World War II, 4 years of war, 3.5, we made 95,000 tanks. We made a tank every 4.5 hours. Less time than it takes my students to proofread their paper. We built 210,000 airplanes. Did you know that in 1941, winter 42, the best Russian fighter plane was the P-39 Airacobra, which was so bad we wouldn't use it, so we gave it to the Russians. We built Liberty ships by the thousands. But all this comes down to this. Through computers, which we had, personal computers, and they didn't, you've yet to hear of Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. Okay? We had the computers, they didn't. They knew, Gorbachev knew we could do this. This is a cruise missile fired from 1,000 miles away at the State Flower of Ohio. And it's about to hit. And so Gorbachev knew he didn't have a chance. Since I did that book, I'll just wrap up with this. I went on to write a book called 7 Events That Made America, and one of the chapters in there was a chapter on how rock music helped Reagan bring down the Iron Curtain. We made that into a movie in 2010. It's available out there. It was on PBS in last November, called Rock and the Wall. And we interviewed people from both sides of the Iron Curtain. And of course, there is the wall. One of the things we found was that as American and Western music started seeping in behind the Iron Curtain, one of the things that the communist kids wanted to do is be like the Americans. Be stoned! Dig the psychedelic sound of the primitives, yeah? I mean, you know. And the Russians sought to deal with this by creating, I kid you not, a ministry of rock. They had a bureaucratic ministry to deal with rock and roll. It's something out of a Jack Black movie, you know, the Ministry of Rock. They gave subsidies to people who would sing pro-communist lyrics and so forth, and people who wouldn't, they cut them out and they got no food and housing subsidies. As more and more Western groups started going behind the Iron Curtain, the first group I've been able to identify was Blood, Sweat, and Tears in 1970. By the mid-'80s, the Russians allowed a group of Russian rockers to tour the U.S., and in '86, this is their album called Red Wave, 4 bands from the USSR. I got this album, it sucks, but it shows that they were listening to American rock. I mean, they really had it. Of course, one of the key events is when Bruce Springsteen plays in East Berlin in front of 80,000 communist youths. That's my cousin Benny youths. And the communists let him in because they think he's a big lib and he's going to say all these nasty things about America. And he says, I'm not here to praise or condemn any legal system. I'm here to play music. And he starts playing Born in the USA. Now, we all know Born in the USA is an anti-Vietnam War song, but most people, unless you read the lyrics, don't really know that because nobody can understand a word Springsteen says. I mean, what? I'm born in the legal day. I said, what? Born in the U.S. Oh, I got that one. So all these kids, 80,000 communist kids are born, and they wanted to be born in the USA. Leslie Mandoki, a Hungarian activist that we interviewed for our movie, said, we all wanted to be Americans. We love America. One of the really interesting things we found in the film was a woman in Dayton from the Ukraine came over, and she said, I was atheist, I was not a communist, but I was atheist. They closed all churches, they banned Bibles, but for some reason they let in the rock opera, Jesus Christ, the Superstar. So I see Jesus Christ, the Superstar, and I come to Jesus through Jesus Christ, the Superstar, and am baptized. And I thought, God and rock and roll, how can you stop that? That's what we did, all right? And I'm happy to take questions.
Oh my God.